There are nights when the past refuses to let you go. For Officer Mason Whitaker, it started with a single whimper in a rusted rail car and ended with a secret that would tear open old wounds, test every boundary of loyalty, and change 2 lives forever. In a world quick to discard the broken, what does it mean to stay? Can a man grieving his own losses heal a dog haunted by betrayal? And can the silent, everyday acts of kindness truly bring the lost home again? If you've ever believed in second chances, or been saved by a friend with no words, tell us, who or what gave you hope when you needed it most? Share your story in the comments below. The night pressed close over Erie, Pennsylvania, the kind of cold that worked its way through every crack, settling into bones and memories. Out by the lake where the city lights faded to shadow and the world shrank to the hush of your own breath. Mason Whitaker ended his shift and told himself, as he always did, that tonight he would just go home. He'd cross the quiet parking lot, keys loose in his fist, and let the silence of his apartment swallow the day. But the world has a way of catching hold of you at your rawest edge. He moved past the edge of the police station lot, cutting across a patch of brittle grass toward the old train depot, a cluster of iron and wood that had been left behind long before Mason moved to Erie. The depot was nothing but rust and weeds now, a graveyard for rail cars, their windows busted, their doors chained shut. Only the wind moved there, and sometimes the ghosts of people who had left too soon. Mason's boots made no sound in the dead grass. He was almost at the end of the lot, mind drifting, when he caught it. A thin, wavering whimper, carried on the wind. Faint, so easy to miss. He stopped, listened. It came again, softer this time, as if whoever made it had almost given up. His heart thudded, slow but heavy. For a long minute he stood still, the air pinched cold on his face, the city behind him nothing but distant traffic and pale streetlights. He didn't want to move. He didn't want to care. But something old and stubborn in him, something he couldn't explain, maybe a thread left over from his father, pushed him forward. The rail yard was a tangle of iron and memory. Mason moved along the cars, shining his flashlight in careful arcs. Light caught on frost, flared off broken glass. The whimper sounded again, closer, cracked and desperate. He followed it to a battered boxcar near the edge of the lot. Its paint peeled to the bone, doors barely hanging on their rails. Something inside him twisted. He didn't call out, just listened. Let the quiet answer back. He tried the latch, frozen, rusted, unmoved for years. He braced his shoulder and forced the door with a grunt. Metal scraped metal, and the wind rushed in, carrying the smell of oil and old straw. There was a pause, a breath, then the sound again, right at his feet. The flashlight beam caught the shape. A German shepherd, big-boned and thick-furred, curled in on itself in the corner, tied so tight against the wall that it looked more shadow than animal. The dog's coat was matted and filthy, streaked with mud and things darker than mud. Its flanks heaved, ribs sharp under the skin, legs awkward and trembling. One ear stood high, the other drooped at a torn angle. Its eyes glimmered, not wild but hollow, more resignation than fear, as if it had learned hope was for others. Mason knelt slowly, boots scraping against old hay. He kept the light low, tried to make his voice gentle, but no words came. There was nothing to say. Only the cold and the hurt, and the thin thread of breath that tied the dog to this world. He reached for his pocket knife, The rope was thick, caked with grime. Every movement made the dog flinch, but it didn't growl, didn't snap. It just watched him, breathing hard, shaking with effort. Mason saw the sores around its midsection, the old scar that ran up the chest in the shape of a broken wing. Under the fur at its throat, the faint outline of a tattoo, numbers blurred by age and a single jagged letter he couldn't quite read. A relic from another life. The knots took time. His hands went numb before the last one gave way. When he pulled the rope loose, the dog collapsed, too weak to run or fight. Mason took off his jacket, bundled it around the shivering body, feeling how light it was, how close to empty. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the loose door on its hinges. The world seemed to close in, breathless and brittle, as Mason gathered the dog in his arms and rose unsteadily to his feet. For a moment, he just stood there in the cold, holding a weight that felt both impossibly heavy and heartbreakingly small. He didn't know what to do next. He only knew he couldn't leave. As he stepped out into the dark, the sky above Erie hung low and colorless, and the old rail cars watched in silence. Somewhere between the broken windows and the restless wind, Mason felt the first thin crack in his own shell. A question, sharp and quiet. Who was this dog, really? Why here? Why now? And what did the faded numbers mean? The city offered no answers. Only woe, the hush of loss, and the shiver of something not yet lost. Something that might, even now, be waiting for rescue. The walk back to Mason's apartment felt longer than it was. Erie's streets were nearly empty at this hour. Streetlights stretched thin across pools of frozen sidewalk. The hush of the lake barely a rumor behind row houses and shuttered stores. Mason walked slow, Atlas bundled in his jacket, pressed close against his chest. The dog's body radiated an uncertain heat, trembling sometimes so hard that Mason had to pause, breathing in the old winter air, feeling the soft weight against his ribs. His apartment sat on the second floor of an aging clapboard building facing the lake, windows fogged with the memory of breath. He fumbled for keys with numb fingers, shoulder aching from the awkward burden, and nudged the door open with his foot. The familiar scent met him, a blend of old wood, faint mildew, and the lemon oil he used to wipe the piano. The heater clattered in the corner, barely pushing against the chill. He carried Atlas inside, closing the door against the world. He set the dog down carefully atop a faded wool blanket in the living room, next to a battered coffee table that still bore the rings of 1,000 coffee cups. Atlas did not move. He curled tighter, tail pressed to his flank, eyes fixed on the gap beneath the door. Mason shed his boots and coat, kneeling beside the dog. He set a shallow bowl of water on the floor, then filled another with chicken broth, still warm from the thermos he carried for long nights. Atlas watched, unmoving, only the quiver of his nose betraying the faintest flicker of interest. Minutes passed. Mason sat cross-legged nearby, careful not to reach, letting the quiet settle. His gaze wandered around the room, walls dotted with old family photos, his father in turnout gear, a younger Mason at his mother's knee, a faded snapshot of a woman he once thought he'd spend his life beside. On the far wall stood the upright piano, its keys dulled by time, the top covered with a cloth and a dusty metronome that rarely kept time anymore. Outside, the lake glimmered behind ice-streaked windows, the world beyond his reach. He didn't turn on the TV, He didn't speak. He just sat, listening to the small, uneven breaths that marked the space between them. Loss echoed in the silences, his own, and now this dog's, wound tight and raw. The clock's hands crept past midnight. Mason rose, stretched out his stiff knees, and crossed to the piano. For a moment he only stood there, fingers tracing the chipped wood, memory flickering in the air. Then, quietly, he lifted the lid and pressed a key. The note rang thin, plaintive, a sliver of sound that filled the emptiness, shimmered, and faded. Another note, softer, the beginnings of a tune his father used to play after long shifts, back when the world felt safer. From the blanket, Atlas stirred. One ear twitched, the uninjured one, and slowly his head lifted. Mason played another note, then a simple arpeggio, nothing fancy, just the bones of a lullaby. The dog's breathing changed, the rhythm smoothing, as if the music eased a knot deep inside. For a moment, the apartment felt less cold. He stopped playing. Silence folded around them again, gentler now. Atlas lay back down, this time resting his head on his paws, eyes half closed. Mason watched him, a little hope opening in his chest, small but undeniable. Later, in the dim light of the kitchen, Mason heated water, stirring it with shaking hands. He washed an old bowl, filling it with soft food and setting it near Atlas. The dog did not eat, not yet, but he sniffed, his tail shifting as if weighing trust against hunger. Mason left him in peace, moving quietly through the motions of bedtime, locking the door, dimming the lights, listening to the heater groan against the cold. He slept little that night, waking often to the creak of the floor, the sigh of wind against glass, the steady click of Atlas's nails on wood. Once, toward morning, he found the dog standing by the window, nose close to the pane, watching the dark water. For a moment, Mason saw himself reflected there, alone, unsure, but still standing. At dawn, with the city still shrouded in gray, Mason ran a bath for Atlas. He coaxed the dog into the tub with gentle words and patient hands. The water turned dark with dirt and old blood. Beneath the matted fur, his fingers found a long scar across the dog's chest, rough and raised, shaped almost like a bird's wing. Lower, near the ribs, the coarse edge of stitches, years old, poorly done. Mason swallowed hard, anger and sorrow knotting in his throat. Someone had hurt this animal, then left him to rot in the dark. He dried Atlas as best he could, wrapping him in a clean towel. The dog shivered, but didn't pull away. Mason met his eyes, one blue, one brown, as if split between two worlds, and saw in them the question he could never quite ask. Why did you survive, when so much wanted you gone? He couldn't answer, but he could offer a place to rest, a quiet room, a song at midnight. He could stay, for now. As Atlas curled up on the blanket, Mason sat beside him. The early light falling across the faded photograph of his father on the mantel. A question lingered, impossible to shake. Who would scar a dog like this? And why was he marked so deeply, inside and out? In the hush that followed, the ache of loss made room for something else. A beginning, fragile as the new day. The days that followed blurred into one another. Gray, cold, ordinary in all the ways that mattered, and in so many ways that didn't. In Mason's apartment, time took on a peculiar shape, measured not in hours but in the length of silences. in the careful dance of coexistence, in the way two broken creatures skirted the edges of one another's pain. Atlas rarely slept, and when he did, it was the fitful doze of someone waiting for something bad to happen. His head would snap up at the sound of a car horn, the slamming of a door, the faint wail of sirens drifting in from the city's restless arteries. Most of the time, he lay beneath the small kitchen table, his big body squeezed into the shadows, watching the world with eyes that missed nothing. Mason kept his movements slow. He would set out a fresh bowl of water each morning, swapping the flavorless tap for a drizzle of broth, and place a new dish of soft food beside it, sometimes with boiled rice, sometimes with shredded turkey. He left the choices there, not watching, not insisting, letting Atlas decide in his own time if the world could be trusted. Sometimes, hours after Mason had stepped away, he'd hear the faint scrape of the bowl against the tiles, a quiet victory that he celebrated only by tucking it away in memory. He resisted the urge to touch, though it went against every instinct. Instead, he'd read in the armchair near the window, glancing up from the page whenever Atlas shifted or sighed. The television stayed off. Even the piano was silent, as if Mason sensed that anything more than the most ordinary piece would shatter the spell. At night, he left the bedroom door ajar, a silent invitation. He lay awake and listened to the apartment settle, pipes ticking, wind whining in the eaves, the distant foghorn from the lake. More than once he heard the soft click of Atlas's claws in the hallway, the hesitant pause at the threshold, but the dog never entered. The world outside, too, pressed its reminders into every moment. A letter from his ex-fiancée, unopened on the counter. A voicemail from his mother, asking if he'd join for dinner on Sunday. He let both sit, untouched. The weather shifted. One morning, rain hammered at the windows, then gave way to a brief, fragile sunlight. Mason found Atlas by the door, nose pressed against the glass, watching the world shimmer on the other side. He took it as a sign. With patience and gentle words, Mason slipped a harness over Atlas's head. The dog flinched at first, hackles rising, but after a long, tense silence, he allowed it. Mason did not try to pet him. He only opened the door, letting in the thin light and the cold, clean air, and waited. They walked the neighborhood in slow circuits, Atlas always on the alert, muscles bunched, ears swiveling at every unexpected noise. Mason kept a loose grip on the leash, giving space, letting the dog choose the path and the pace. There were small triumphs. The moment Atlas paused to sniff a patch of grass, the flicker of his tail when a flock of sparrows erupted from a hedge. Each time, Mason felt something inside him soften, stretch toward hope. It was late on the third night that it happened. Thunder rolled in from the lake, low and ominous, rattling the old window frames. Mason was at the kitchen sink when Atlas, usually so rigid in his solitude, pressed suddenly against his leg, trembling from head to tail. For a moment, neither of them moved. The storm built, the room filled with shadows, and Mason reached down, slow, careful, and rested his hand, palm open, on Atlas's shoulder. The contact was brief, but the dog didn't pull away. They stood like that, two silhouettes in the dim light, listening to the rain until the thunder faded and the quiet returned. Afterward, Mason called Dr. Linda Hennessy, the local vet, and scheduled a house call for the next morning. He wasn't sure how Atlas would react to a stranger, but something in the dog's eyes told him they couldn't keep hiding forever. Dr. Hennessy arrived with a gentle knock, bringing with her the faint scent of lavender and antiseptic. She spoke little, moving with the quiet competence of someone who had seen more suffering than most. She knelt near Atlas, letting him sniff her hand, murmuring to him in a voice soft as water. She examined the scars and stitched flesh, her brows knitting with concern. "He's been through a lot," she said quietly, not looking at Mason. She scanned his neck, frowning as she ran her fingers across the spot where a microchip should have been. "The chip's been removed. Clean work, but look." She pointed to a small, almost invisible line of numbers, half erased but still legible in the right light. Mason bent closer. The numbers meant nothing to him, but he copied them down, a seed of unease planting itself deep in his gut. As Dr. Hennessy packed her bag, Atlas sat perfectly still, tail curled tight, gaze darting from her to Mason and back again. There was gratitude there, but also an unspoken question, one Mason felt echo in his own chest. What do you do with trust once it's been broken? That night, as Mason sat in the dark, the city's hush pressing in on all sides, he listened to Atlas finally eat, slow and methodical, from the bowl left by his feet. Outside, the world spun on as always, cold, uncertain, dangerous. But inside, the apartment held something new, not peace, not yet, but the possibility of it. And at the threshold between rooms, a dog and a man learned, in silence, how to stay. Days moved slowly on the edge of eerie, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Mason found comfort in routine shuffling in the early morning walks around the lake, when mist hovered like a memory above the water and the city seemed suspended between darkness and light. Sometimes, as they walked, Atlas would pause, hackles lifted at the distant sound of construction or the sudden bark of another dog. But he never pulled away. Each morning felt like the first step on an endless road neither of them could see the end of. Inside, Mason pieced together fragments of the dog's past. He spent hours searching through police databases, forums for lost pets, even old news stories, cross-referencing the faded tattoo on Atlas's neck. Most records led nowhere. But the numbers Dr. Hennessy had found, a partial federal K-9 code, pointed him towards something unexpected. A redacted file linked to a missing police dog, once part of a special trafficking task force in Michigan. 3 years ago, the case had closed without resolution. The more he read, the more the ache in Mason's chest grew. There were things in Atlas that didn't fit the story of a stray. When Mason's neighbor, a retired steelworker named Dennis, shouted to his wife across the hallway, Atlas flattened himself to the ground, ears back, tail tucked, shivering, nearly disappearing into the floor. But when a group of children giggled outside, chasing one another through the courtyard, the dog watched with his head tilted, curious, almost gentle. Once in the park, a woman with silver hair approached with slow steps. Atlas froze, every muscle tense. But as she knelt and held out her hand, the dog surprised them both, sitting down, letting her touch his head, eyes closing for a heartbeat. Mason recognized something softening in that moment. He wondered if some part of Atlas remembered another life, another kindness, someone he'd once belonged to, long before the dark boxcar and the years lost to fear. But peace was brief, fragile as glass. One evening, while Mason was sorting through the mail, his phone rang. The caller ID was blocked. He hesitated, thumb hovering, then answered. At first, there was only silence, a hush thick enough to feel. Then a voice, low and almost bored, as if reading from a script. Some things are better left alone, Officer Whitaker. Not your dog. Not your business. Let it go. The line clicked dead before Mason could answer. He stood in the kitchen, heart thudding, the sound of the world falling away. On the floor, Atlas watched him, head low, the scar on his chest catching a slant of light from the window. That night, sleep came in fits. Mason lay awake, listening for sounds that didn't belong, the crunch of tires in the alley, the slow tick of pipes, the hum of his own worry. Each time he drifted, he dreamed of fire and thunder and the metallic taste of fear. He woke to Atlas pacing the hallway, restless, nose pressed to the gap beneath the front door. When the morning finally arrived, Mason went to his closet and pulled out the box where he kept his father's service revolver. He checked the chamber, the weight of old habits settling into his hands. He set the gun on his bedside table, feeling its cold promise and the shame that followed. He did not want to live like this, on edge, suspicious, bracing for what might come. But the past, it seemed, had found its way to his door. Still, routine pulled him forward. He called the eerie precinct, asked a friend in records to run the number from Atlas's tattoo again, quietly, off the books. Hours later, a message pinged his phone. K9451B, assigned to a trafficking task force, Flint, Michigan. Handler, Detective Sharon Doyle. Missing after an operation gone wrong. 3 officers wounded, 1 presumed dead. The dog never recovered. Case closed, files sealed. He stared at the screen, the names and dates blurring. He imagined Atlas in another city, another winter. His world torn apart and rebuilt by hands that did not care if he survived. Late that afternoon, a storm rolled over the lake. Rain lashed the glass, and the world shrank to the rhythm of water against wood. Mason sat on the floor near Atlas, who had taken to lying beneath the piano, his breathing slow but never easy. He spoke softly, words spilling into the quiet. "You were a hero once, weren't you?" Atlas didn't move, but Mason saw a tremor in his flanks, a shadow crossing his face. There were questions Mason wanted to ask, the kind that had no answers. What had Atlas seen in those lost years? What had he endured, and why had he been left behind? As darkness gathered, Mason moved to the window, watching the lake disappear in fog. He felt the press of his father's memory at his back. Duty, loyalty, the weight of old wounds, the ache of not knowing how to protect what mattered most. Behind him, the silence was broken only by the slow rhythm of the dog's breath, a sound as steady and uncertain as hope itself. Somewhere deep in the apartment, the phone buzzed with a new message. Mason picked it up, hands unsteady. A photo. Atlas, years younger, standing proud beside a woman in uniform. In the corner, the blurred shape of a man Mason didn't recognize, face turned away, badge glinting under harsh light. The past was closer than he'd thought, and someone wanted it to stay buried. After the storm, the world seemed rinsed clean, every branch slick with rain, every puddle a mirror for the gray sky. Morning came with a hush. Mason watched from his window as the first real sunlight in days filtered through the streaked glass, casting uncertain gold across the floor. The apartment felt lighter, almost expectant, as if the air itself was bracing for something new. Atlas lay by the door, gaze fixed on the shifting shadows outside. Mason took this as a sign. He fetched the harness and leash, moving slow, giving Atlas time to rise, joints stiff and hesitant. There was no command, only an invitation. Would you come with me, just this once? Down on the street, the city was just waking. A few cars nosed through puddles, sending ripples across the stillness. Mason steered their path toward the lake, keeping to the quiet side streets, giving Atlas space to breathe in the world, step by cautious step. The shepherd moved with a strange mixture of wariness and longing, nose always searching, as if every scent might conjure a ghost from the past. At the edge of the park, Atlas hesitated. Mason knelt, not reaching, simply resting his hand on the cool grass, waiting. For a long minute, dog and man sat together in the hush, the lake breathing softly just beyond the tree line. A pair of joggers passed. A stroller squeaked on the path, and Atlas's ears flicked, tail curling tighter. But he didn't bolt. It was there, in the filtered sunlight, that they met Mrs. Greeley, Mason's elderly neighbor from the ground floor. She wore her usual lavender coat, thin and bright against the morning gloom, her silver hair tucked into a neat bun. She stopped, eyeing Mason, then the dog. "Oh, is this the new friend I've seen at your window?" she asked, voice a melody of years gone soft with kindness. Atlas froze, body tense, as Mrs. Greeley approached. But instead of pulling away, he watched her, gaze unwavering. She crouched with some effort, reaching a weathered hand toward his muzzle, palm up and open. "It's all right, darling," she said softly. "I've known a few like you in my time." Atlas inched forward, almost against his own will, until his nose brushed her palm. For one breathless moment, he was utterly still. Then, slowly, uncertainly, he let her fingers graze the soft fur beneath his jaw. Mrs. Greeley smiled, tears bright in her eyes, and Mason felt something in him unclench. "You're a good soul," she whispered to Atlas, as if delivering a secret. "Sometimes the world forgets what that means." Mason stood silent, feeling as if he were intruding on a moment meant for someone else. When Mrs. Greeley rose, she squeezed his arm. "He's got a story, your boy. You be patient. The broken ones come back when they're ready." Back at the apartment, the mood shifted. Atlas followed Mason from room to room, never close enough to touch, but never far. That night, as rain returned in a soft drizzle, Mason left the door to his bedroom half open, a silent offer. He woke sometime near dawn, a weight against his leg. Atlas, curled on the old rug by the bed, breathing slow, safe at last. The days grew a rhythm, gentle and fragile. Mason cooked simple meals, letting the dog watch from the threshold of the kitchen, waiting for the scrape of bowl against tile. Sometimes, in the quiet afternoons, Mason played a few notes on the piano, the melodies unsure, searching. Atlas would lie in the doorway, one ear turned to the music, eyelids fluttering, as if caught between waking and dream. Yet Mason felt the past at his back, insistent as the wind that battered the windows each evening. He kept thinking of the phone call, the photo, the unanswered questions about Atlas's old life. The dog, too, seemed haunted, sometimes pacing the apartment as dusk fell, nose pressed to closed doors, tail low, as if searching for someone lost. At times, Mason saw him pause at the old coat stand, sniffing at a faded scarf that had belonged to Mason's ex-fiancée, eyes distant, almost remembering. One evening, as he sorted through a box of odds and ends he'd rescued from his last move, Mason found an old collar tucked inside a newspaper dated nearly 3 years ago. The leather was cracked, the tag worn smooth, but something about the way it fit in his palm made him shiver. As he turned the collar over, a slip of paper fell out, a folded, creased photograph. He opened it slowly. The image was grainy but clear. Atlas, younger and stronger, sitting proudly beside a woman in police uniform. Her eyes were dark, steady, full of the kind of tiredness only seen in those who've fought too long. Written on the back, in quick, cramped letters, Sharon and Atlas, Flint, 2019. Always bring him home. Mason stared at the photo, the questions multiplying. Who was this woman? Why had she vanished from every record? Why was Atlas left behind? And what did bring him home mean after all this time? He felt the weight of Atlas's gaze from across the room, a silent presence, half shadow, half memory. Mason tucked the collar away, the photograph safe inside his wallet. That night, as he drifted to sleep, he wondered how many broken souls found their way to each other in the dark, and what it cost to let someone back in. A new thread had been pulled loose. The name Sharon, the image of Atlas before the scars, and a promise to bring him home. But what had happened to her? And could the past ever really let go? The winter deepened, settling over Erie with a cold that seeped through every wall and floorboard. Snow gathered in soft heaps along the sidewalks, muffling the city's edges until even the lake itself seemed to disappear behind a curtain of white. Mason grew quieter. Atlas spent long hours lying by the front door, alert to sounds only he could hear, as if listening for footsteps that never came. The photograph of Sharon and Atlas pressed its presence into every day, its meaning an unanswered ache. Mason became restless, searching for details online, calling precincts in Michigan, running into the thick brick wall of sealed records and missing persons. He tried every route, official and unofficial, but always the same silence on the other end of the line. Sometimes, sitting by the window with his coffee cooling untouched, Mason felt the old urge to run, to shed his own name and past. Instead, he stayed, letting the uncertainty and the weight of Atlas's story settle into him. One evening, after another sleepless night, Mason made a decision. He booked a day off and filled the car with gas, leaving a note for his mother and a bowl full of treats for Atlas. The dog leapt into the back seat at the sound of keys, not eager, but ready. They drove west under a sky bruised with morning. Atlas silent, gaze fixed on the road, a passenger as much as a witness. Flint, Michigan, came up cold and gray, a city of empty lots and red brick buildings half swallowed by time. Mason followed the address he'd found on an old personnel list, double-checked against local records, half expecting nothing. He parked by a weathered house on a quiet street, the yard untended, faded wind chimes clinking in the icy breeze. He knocked, breath clouding. No answer. He tried again. At last the door creaked open, not far, just enough for a pair of sharp eyes to appear behind the screen. A cluster of cats wound around the woman's ankles, their tails flicking warily. "Detective Doyle?" Mason's voice was softer than he meant, cautious as if the wrong note might shatter the moment. The woman, Sharon, hesitated, lips tightening. Her hair, once dark, had gone mostly silver, clipped short. She wore a thick sweater, sleeves rolled over slender wrists marked by old scars. She did not look surprised, only tired. "I don't take visitors," she said. But then she saw Atlas, waiting at Mason's heel, ears back, eyes full of recognition and fear and something else, a deep, hollow longing. The air changed, taut and electric. Sharon stepped out, hands trembling, then still. She crouched with effort, meeting Atlas eye to eye. For a long time, nothing happened. The world shrank to the faint jingle of cat collars, the sound of Mason's breath. Atlas did not move, but his tail thumped once on the porch, slow and uncertain. Sharon reached out, her palm open, her voice only a whisper. "It's you. Oh God, it's really you." Tears slid down her face, unremarked, quiet as snowfall. She touched the dog's head, fingers finding old scars, running gently over the place where his fur parted at the wing-shaped mark. For a moment, the whole world seemed to hang in the hush between them. Sharon pressed her forehead to Atlas's, closing her eyes. "I'm sorry," she breathed. "I should have come for you. I'm so sorry." Mason watched, feeling as if he were intruding on something sacred. He saw then the cost of survival, not just the pain of those left behind, but the guilt of those forced to let go. Inside, the house was cluttered with books and cat beds. Faded citations hung on the wall beside a tarnished badge. Sharon poured coffee with hands that only shook when she thought he wasn't looking. She answered questions in fragments, memory swimming in and out of reach. She remembered the night Atlas disappeared. Gunfire, confusion, someone yelling orders that turned to chaos. She was injured, hospitalized for months. Memory lost, to a fog of painkillers and sleeplessness. She never learned what happened after, only that her dog was gone and her own career ended quietly, mercilessly. "There was a man on the task force," she said, voice cracking. "Trusted him. He turned, sold information. People got hurt. Some things," she shook her head, eyes glazed with exhaustion. "Some things they don't want brought back." Atlas lay at her feet, chin resting on her slipper, the connection between them quiet and unbreakable. Sharon knelt, brushed her hand along his neck, whispering something private, words Mason could not hear. In her touch was both farewell and forgiveness. When Mason stood to leave, Sharon followed him to the door. She didn't meet his eyes, but her words were low and urgent. "Be careful," she said. "They're watching. Someone in the force, maybe more than one. If you dig, they'll come for you too. I wish I could help. I wish I'd tried harder. I'm tired, Mason. I just want to rest." Outside, Flint seemed emptier than before. Mason helped Atlas into the car, the dog glancing back at the porch where Sharon stood, shoulders slumped, hands pressed to her face. As they drove away, snow began to fall again, gentle and relentless. The miles home stretched long and silent. Mason felt the burden of what he'd learned, the betrayals that ripple outward, the cost of looking back. At a red light, he reached over, his hand finding the rough warmth of Atlas's fur. For once, the dog did not flinch. Sharon's warning lingered in Mason's mind. Someone on the inside had betrayed them all, and Atlas was more than a witness. He was a threat to those who would rather see him forgotten. But who had turned? And how much danger was truly waiting in the shadows? The return to Erie felt different this time. A cold wind off the lake sharper, shadows longer, every alley seeming to hold its breath. Mason's hands lingered on the wheel as he pulled up outside his apartment building. The trip to Flint, the brief, shattering reunion with Sharon, her warning pressed against his heart. It all seemed to have changed the color of the world. Even Atlas moved differently now, closer at Mason's side, head up, scanning the sidewalk with the practiced caution of someone who knew what it meant to be hunted. At night, Mason watched headlights crawl along the far end of the block, taillights flicker and fade, a car idling too long near the corner. He tried to tell himself it was nothing. This was a city, after all. But something in his gut, something old and primal, would not let him sleep. Inside the apartment, routine became protection. The doors were double-checked, windows locked. Mason moved with a deliberate calm, never showing the unease that coiled inside him. He left the radio off, kept his phone close, eyes flicking to the front entrance at every unexpected noise. Atlas felt it too. The dog was restless, padding the hallway at night, standing at the window for long minutes, nose pressed to the cold glass. Sometimes he would startle awake, body rigid, head up, listening to the silence for the threat he knew was there. A week passed with the tension growing. Small things, a trash can tipped over outside, a slip of paper jammed into the doorframe with no words on it, the faint smell of tobacco smoke beneath Mason's window at midnight. He kept his revolver by the bed, locked but loaded, the weight both comfort and warning. On a Friday evening, as the sun dipped low behind the lake, the power went out. The heater gave a last stuttering cough. The apartment fell into a hush, broken only by the tick of the cooling pipes. Mason's phone screen glowed in the dim, but the city grid had gone down for blocks. He sat quietly, listening to his own heartbeat, to the dog's breath, to the city's new, uneasy silence. Then, a sound on the stairs. Not a neighbor's slow, familiar tread, but the careful, purposeful creak of someone moving in the dark. Atlas was up in an instant, silent and alert, blocking the space between Mason and the door. Mason stood, body tight, hand already moving for the revolver in the drawer. A heavy knock. Another. Then the unmistakable scrape of a key. No, not a key. Something metal. At the lock. Mason held his breath. Atlas growled, a deep rumbling warning that filled the darkness. A pause outside, then a sudden frantic rattle at the door. The knob twisted, stuck. Mason stepped to the side, voice steady and cold. "You picked the wrong house," he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone listening. Another blow at the door. Mason tensed, every muscle wound tight, but Atlas moved first, stepping between Mason and the entrance, body low, tail rigid, all his focus on the thin crack of light beneath the frame. A beat of silence. Then the footsteps retreated, pounding down the stairs, fading into the echo of distant sirens somewhere across the city. Mason waited, heart pounding. He listened for a long time before unlocking the door, stepping out into the corridor. Nothing but shadows. The stairwell was empty, the air thick with the smell of adrenaline and fear. He knelt beside Atlas, letting his hand rest on the dog's back, feeling the tremor beneath the fur. Atlas pressed against him, eyes wide but steady, and in that moment Mason saw the ghost of his father, a man who'd stood between danger and the people he loved, not with bravado but with a quiet, unbreakable calm. They made it through the night, but the world felt changed. The next morning, Mason found an ID badge in the mailbox. No note, just a laminated card, faded photo, the name Andrew Laird. The badge was for a Michigan precinct, the same force where Sharon had worked, the same department tangled in Atlas's vanished years. He turned the badge over and over in his hands, mind racing. Someone had come looking. Someone who wanted to remind Mason and Atlas that the past was never truly gone. Someone who might be watching still. That afternoon, as the snow began to fall again, Mason sat by the window with Atlas at his feet. He thought about the night before. The threat barely averted, the line between courage and fear blurred thin. The city outside looked ordinary. Mail trucks, children sledding down a hill, a neighbor shoveling his walk. But Mason knew the ordinary could hide what was dangerous, and that being brave sometimes meant staying put, holding the line for one more night. Atlas lay with his head in Mason's lap, eyes closing at last, the rhythm of his breath slowly finding peace. Turning the ID badge in his palm, Mason realized Andrew Laird had worked side by side with Sharon on the old task force. There were ties here, secrets spanning years and miles. The question that lingered, who, among those sworn to protect, had crossed the line, and who was willing to do anything to keep that secret buried? Days passed, heavy with unspoken questions. The city moved around Mason, cars skating through slush, the far-off blare of train horns, the lake's endless shiver against the gray sky. But within his apartment, time moved slower, thickened by memory and doubt. Mason found himself pacing the rooms late at night, hand running along the cool plaster walls, mind returning always to the badge on his kitchen table and Sharon's trembling warning. Atlas watched every movement, always near, always listening, his own fear tempered now by a kind of determined stillness. Mason began to see the world in layers. The surface, neighbors waving, children laughing, Mrs. Sham, Greeley's cheerful knock for borrowed sugar. Underneath, the chill at his nape, the car parked too long across the street, a message on his windshield. Nothing written, just the old newspaper from Flint, folded once, set exactly in the center. He kept searching, combing through records and rumors, piecing together fragments from Sharon's stories, the precinct badge and Atlas's scars. At night, with the city muffled under new snow, he mapped connections on yellow legal pads, names, dates, a chain of transfers from Flint to Erie. Patterns emerged, a line of officers reassigned or disappeared, operations gone sideways. The same rumors whispered about every place Atlas had ever surfaced. But the past didn't give up its secrets easily. Mason understood, for the first time, how easy it would be to let it go, to close the door, pull the blinds, give Atlas a quiet home and call it enough. It would be safer. He could almost taste the relief in that choice, the ache of surrender that sometimes felt like kindness. He watched Atlas sometimes, seeing the way the dog's ears flicked at the faintest sound, the way he refused to turn his back to a closed door. Mason saw his own reflection in the dog's eyes, not just fear, but the bone-deep exhaustion of survival, the longing to rest without looking over your shoulder. One night, after another day of questions with no answers, Mason sat on the floor beside Atlas, the two of them outlined by the dim glow of the streetlights. Mason reached out, laying his hand on the thick fur along Atlas's back, fingers tracing the old scars, the barely visible tattoo. "I don't know what the right thing is anymore," he whispered, voice nearly lost to the quiet. "Maybe we just stay here. Let the past be the past." Atlas shifted, pressing his head against Mason's leg. For a moment, the room held its breath, the world reduced to the hush of breath, the steady beat of two hearts not quite healed. The silence was answer enough, but the world would not let them hide. The next afternoon, the phone rang, a number Mason didn't know but recognized. Sharon's voice, hoarse and strained. "I found something," she said. "Old evidence, records, logs, video, things I kept hidden even from myself. It's all here. I don't trust the mail. Meet me, please. It has to be in person." Mason hesitated, feeling the old instinct for caution rise, the desire to turn away. But he heard in Sharon's voice what he recognized in himself: the need, after so many years of silence, to finally let go of the burden. He agreed. They would meet the next night at a small chapel on the outskirts of Erie, a place neither of them had any history, quiet and dim, safe in its obscurity. That evening, Mason moved through his apartment with the certainty of someone about to cross a threshold. He made a simple dinner, setting Atlas's bowl beside his own, savoring the small ritual of trust and presence. Afterward, they sat together on the rug, the old piano silent in the corner, the night pressed close around the windows. Mason let his hand rest on Atlas, steady and gentle. "Thank you," he whispered, the words heavy with things unsaid, for surviving, for not giving up, for reminding Mason what it meant to fight for something you couldn't name. He packed a small bag, flashlight, the badge, his notes, a copy of the photograph of Sharon and Atlas. Before bed, he walked through the apartment, double-checking locks, moving with the care of someone who had learned how easily safety could vanish. That night, sleep came and went. Mason drifted through dreams of water and shadow, the echo of gunshots, Atlas's howl cutting through the dark. Each time he woke, Atlas was there, close by, his breathing slow and even, anchoring Mason to the world. By dawn, a thin veil of frost covered the windows, the city washed clean by a night of new snow. Mason moved quietly, heart steady despite the fear that curled around every thought. He stood for a long time at the window, watching the city wake, letting hope and dread coexist. He made a silent promise. Whatever happened, Atlas would not be left behind again. He would see this through, not out of duty, but out of the fierce, quiet love that had grown in the spaces between wounds. As the sun rose, Mason's phone buzzed with a final message from Sharon. "Don't come alone, and don't trust anyone, not even those who wear the badge." The choice was made. There would be no turning back now. But who, in the end, would truly be waiting at the chapel, and what price would the truth demand? Night fell early over Erie, shadows crowding the streets and gathering thick around the chapel on the city's edge. It was an old stone building, half swallowed by bare oaks, the steeple leaning slightly as if bowed beneath secrets only the dead remembered. Mason arrived just after sundown, headlights cutting the mist. Atlas sat in the passenger seat, ears pricked, every sense alive. The parking lot was empty, but for one battered sedan. Mason recognized it from Sharon's driveway in Flint. He scanned the lot, the line of trees, the crosshatch of footprints in the dirty snow. He left his phone hidden beneath the seat, locked the car, and clipped the leash to Atlas's collar. For a moment, man and dog stood together, letting their breath settle into the hush. Inside, the chapel was cold, candlelit only at the altar, flickering points of gold in the gloom. The pews stood in silent rows, the smell of dust and wax and old stone thick in the air. At the far end, Sharon waited, shoulders hunched, a small box clutched in her hands. Her face was drawn but fierce, lit by the uncertain fire. Atlas pulled forward, his body taut, then relaxed as Sharon whispered his name. The dog moved to her side, pressing close, and she reached down, her touch a silent benediction. Mason approached, slow and wary. The chapel doors creaked once, then swung shut behind him, someone else entering, heavy footfalls echoing up the nave. Mason turned, the tension in the room coiling tighter. Two figures stood in the entry's gloom, outlined by the dim light. One in a long overcoat, the other broad-shouldered, a shape Mason knew too well from old photos. Andrew Laird, his face older, heavier, but unmistakable. At his side, another man, gun half concealed in a gloved hand. No words at first, just the brittle silence of old grievances resurfacing. Sharon rose, box in hand, voice trembling but clear. "It ends tonight. No more running." Laird stepped forward, hands open. "Sharon, Mason, let's not make this worse. You don't know the whole story. You don't know what it cost." His voice was tired, brittle with the edge of someone who had justified too much for too long. Mason kept his stance loose, every muscle wound but steady. "We know enough. The files, the badge. People were hurt. Dogs like Atlas left behind. And for what? Your silence?" Laird's partner shifted, gun rising slightly. "Stop." Atlas stood between Mason and Sharon, silent but unyielding, tail low, every sense fixed on the threat. Sharon's hands shook. She held the box out. "Proof, everything you tried to hide. Names, payments, recordings. You can kill me, Andrew, but the truth won't die with me." A pause, deep and shuddering. The wind rattled the stained glass windows. Atlas growled, low and guttural, not in rage but in warning, a presence that would not be ignored. Mason spoke, quiet but unbreakable. "You have a choice, Andrew. Walk away, let it go, or live with this for the rest of your life. This," he nodded to Atlas, "is what you left behind. All these years," and he never forgot. Laird's face twisted, something crumbling behind his eyes. Regret, guilt, the slow, sick gravity of memory. He lowered his gaze. His partner's hand trembled on the gun, doubt flickering in the cold light. It didn't take violence to end it. It took the steady weight of truth. Laird let his hands fall to his sides. "I was afraid," he whispered, voice cracking. "Afraid of losing everything. Afraid of being left behind myself." For a long moment, no one moved. Sharon's breath hitched. Atlas stepped forward, meeting Laird's gaze, eyes dark with memory. The look was not accusation. It was mourning. The silent testament of the betrayed. Laird's partner, shaken, lowered the gun. Sharon knelt, placing the box on the altar, shoulders quaking with relief and exhaustion. "Let it be over," she said. "Let us go home." Atlas pressed his head into her hands, sighing, as if letting go of years of vigilance. Mason closed his eyes, the tension in his chest finally breaking. He realized the war was not just out there, but inside each of them. A battle to keep believing in the possibility of healing, even when the world had tried to teach them only fear. Outside, police lights flashed against the windows. Someone had tipped off the authorities, the old secrets now too loud to keep. Laird stood quietly, waiting for the end, tears tracking the dust on his face. Mason felt the weight lift from his shoulders. Not joy, not victory, but the ache of release. The chapel, for all its cold, felt suddenly sacred, a place where memory could finally rest. Laird surrendered quietly, hands out, eyes hollow but relieved. As officers led him away, Mason saw Sharon clutch Atlas close, whispering her thanks. The real question lingered, unsaid. Could any of them truly heal from the wounds left behind? Or would memory itself always haunt the threshold between hope and loss? Morning breaks soft over Erie, the horizon painted in pale gold, the lake quiet as breath. For the first time in weeks, Mason sleeps through the dawn, Atlas curled at the foot of his bed, both of them surrendered to the kind of rest earned only after the longest nights. News of the arrests makes its way through the city in whispers and cautious relief. At the precinct, there are questions, headlines, and speculation. But for Mason, the world narrows to the boundaries of home, his own heartbeat, Atlas's deep, even breathing, and the silent understanding that nothing will ever return to what it was. And somehow, that's all right. In the following days, Sharon's testimony helps close the last open files. She chooses to leave the city, settling into a quieter life beyond the reach of old ghosts. On her last evening in Erie, she visits Mason's apartment one final time. The apartment smells of fresh coffee and snowmelt, sunlight warming the faded rug. Sharon kneels by Atlas, her face open and unguarded, tears shining in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispers, fingers tangled in the shepherd's fur. "You brought me home, too." She stands, hands trembling, but when she hugs Mason, she is steady, grief and gratitude braided together, impossible to pull apart. "Take care of each other," she says. Mason can only nod, throat tight with words he'll never say aloud. The world grows gentle again. Mason finds himself lingering over the smallest things, the scratch of Atlas's nails on the hardwood, the scent of pine drifting through a cracked window, the way late morning light spills across the kitchen counter. The city seems softer, less haunted. Each morning, they walk the edge of the lake, breath hanging in the bright cold, the world waking around them. Atlas moves with quiet purpose, no longer scanning every shadow, pausing sometimes to watch the ducks, or press his nose into the snow, or simply stand beside Mason. The two of them content in their silent company. The piano gathers less dust. On certain afternoons, Mason lifts the cover, presses a gentle chord, lets the melody wind through the rooms. Atlas lies on the rug, ears half raised, tail thumping in lazy approval, the music knitting a fragile peace between memory and hope. Sometimes, Mason sits by the window, mug warming his palms, eyes lingering on the photograph of his father. He thinks of all that has been lost and all that has been found. The ache remains, grief, regret, the knowledge that some wounds never fully close. But within that ache, something else has taken root. Gratitude for what remains, for the chance to bear witness to another's healing. He notices, one morning, that the old tattoo on Atlas's neck has faded further, a blur beneath the fur, barely more than a shadow now. Only the scar remains, a reminder that survival isn't about erasing what's come before, but learning to live with it, to let it soften over time. There are moments, in the quiet, when Mason wonders how many others wait at the edge of the world, people and dogs, bruised by loss, but still choosing to stay, to try, to offer a place by the fire and a steady hand in the dark. He thinks of Mrs. Greeley, of Sharon, of Andrew Laird. No one perfect, no one unscarred. Just souls with their own stories, doing the best they can with what they're given. On the first real warm day of spring, Mason and Atlas run by the water, the sun breaking through the last of the gray. They race each other, laughing, one with words, one with the pure joy of motion, until they collapse in the grass, heartbeats echoing. Later, as dusk settles, Mason sits at the piano, the window open to the hush of evening. Atlas lies close, eyes half closed, body finally at peace. Mason's fingers find a melody, simple and unfinished. The music floats, carrying the memory of loss, the gift of staying, the quiet, unspectacular miracle of surviving together. The numbers fade, but the scar remains, a silent badge of everything endured and overcome. Mason traces it with gentle fingers, whispering a promise. Here in this home you are not forgotten. Here the wounded find their place to rest. How many hearts, human and animal, wait quietly for someone to choose to stay? And how many lives are healed, not by fixing what is broken, but by simply sharing the silence, day after day, until hope returns? There are wounds that never fully fade, and memories that linger like shadows at the edge of mourning. Yet sometimes, healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means sharing the silence with someone who understands, learning to stay when the world urges you to run, and letting small acts of kindness stitch us back together. Mason and Atlas never found perfection. They simply found each other, and in their quiet companionship, discovered that the most ordinary days can become extraordinary when we choose not to give up. Sometimes, it's the broken who show us what it means to be whole, and the ones left behind who teach us how to begin again. If this story touched something quiet in your heart, or if you've ever found comfort in the company of a loyal friend, human or animal, we'd love to hear from you. What moment of kindness, loss, or healing changed your path? Share your memory or a lesson learned below. Your story might become the hope someone else needs today. Thank you for listening and for believing, even in silence, that every soul deserves a chance to come home.